About his co-ministry. He actually has a ministry down in Mexico too, but he's the student's student. He taught both Nicole and I our metaphysical Bible, and he's so astute in almost every religious tradition that's ever been. We're honored to have him. Please welcome Reverend Dr. Guy Williams.
Probably wasn't a good idea to take this off right now. Talk amongst yourselves. Yes. So, I don't know what I'm going to do here. So, now can you hear me? Good, good. So I bring you greetings from the Hilltop Spiritual Center, which is in Fallbrook, California, which is my spiritual home, and I get to serve. It's a pleasure and it's an honor to be there. And I also have the distinct privilege of being the spiritual director of the Corazon Global in Tijuana, Mexico. From both communities, I send you greetings. And I hesitated about doing this joke because my partner says I'm not funny. But I heard this joke and I laughed for 2 days. And probably the only person that's going to appreciate this joke is Reverend Michael, but maybe not. So a horse walks into a bar and he orders a drink. And the bartender says, "You've been in here every day this week. Do you think you're an alcoholic?" And the horse goes, "I don't think I am," and disappears and ceases to exist. Now, the only way that that joke can be funny is if you understand Rene Descartes' "I think, therefore I am." But that would mean wait, I haven't gotten to the punchline yet. That would mean putting Descartes before the horse. I think that's funny. Like I said, my girlfriend says, don't do that. Oliver Wendell Holmes once said that a mind expanded by a new idea cannot shrink back to its original size. And it has a lot to do with the teachings of a first century homeless Palestinian who taught in parables. And he taught about ideas, and if you look at the things he talked about things like the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, or like the kingdom of heaven is like a leaven that goes into dough, and he gives different analogies. But these are the things that are interesting, and if a person was a first century Palestinian, they might understand it, is his idea of the kingdom of heaven was corruption. Because once the mind is exposed to a new idea, it cannot shrink back to its original size. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking a little bit about today. And I want to start with a quote by Dr. Holmes, who says that life is both an art and a science. It's an art in the sense that an art of something is a craft that can be learned either through experience or study or observation. And science is a body of knowledge that is public, meaning if it is known one place, it must be known everywhere. It is able to be demonstrated and it can be replicated. So life is something that can be learned and practiced and taught. And the great mystics of all ages offered insight into how we can do this. And I think if you take our teaching, the science of mind and spirit, and you put it against the great religious traditions of the ages, we can kind of see that they come down to maybe two thoughts, probably more, but for the sake of our time too. And it is this. The first is that there is a living presence that permeates all things. Call it what you want. Call it Atma. Call it the Logos, call it Shekhinah, whatever religion, whatever tradition, but there's this idea that there's this living presence that permeates all matter, all creation. And the second thing is this, is that thoughts are causative. Thoughts are causative. And I think for many people, the root of our suffering, the root of the limitations that we may find in our life come down to this, that we don't appreciate how powerful our thoughts are in shaping our perception of how things are. And how we perceive things in many ways creates our response or our experience of things. So we can say in a very real way that our thoughts create our experience of reality. And I kind of want to explore that a little bit today, and I want to explore it from, like I said, the teachings of my teacher, this first century Palestinian homeless person. And he told stories, but one of the things that he used to say, I think that was really interesting is this, is he would make this statement, and you can find this in Matthew chapter 6 if you're keeping score. He says, seek first the kingdom of the heavens, and all else shall be given to you. Now, I was raised Roman Catholic, and what that meant when I heard that first was, repent, clean things up, seek first the kingdom, and I got to do something, or, I got to make travel plans before I die, or any of those kinds of things. But the reality is, it's not what it means. If we look at the Greek, now Jesus didn't speak Greek, he spoke Aramaic, but the Gospels were written in Greek. And so the words that are used here are zorin anoniam. And my Koine Greek is awful. But what it means is absolute livingness. So what Jesus is saying here is seek first the opportunity of absolute livingness, and then everything else is given. So from a mystical point of view, we can play with this, but what we're understanding in the realms of neuroscience and brain science is there's a lot of truth in that. Because if we seek an emotional state, and if we talk about something like absolute livingness, another word for that is joy. Joy is the emotional evocation of the state of well-being. So if we seek the emotional state of well-being, joy, something physical happens to us. Our brain patterns get disrupted and rearranged. Chemicals are released into our body through something called emotions, which moves us into a state of being. Lights turn on and real estate is opened into our brain. We begin to perceive things from a different point of view. We begin to attract things differently, and consciously and unconsciously, we begin to move towards our good. So, the very act of attending, paying attention, seeking this emotional state of well-being draws to us the good that we are seeking. And what I want to offer is, we often get confused as to what that is. And I want to offer two things as I distill into this. One is when I work with students or when I work with clients, one of the first questions that I ask is this: what kind of universe do you live in? Do you live in a universe that is benign or malefic? Is it intelligent or void? Is it working for you or against you? Because how we answer that question kind of determines the trajectory of our life. And so Emma Curtis Hopkins, who was one of these very interesting characters in the beginning of the New Thought movement, used to say this. She used to say that the first law of metaphysics is to seek our good. What is your good? And it's not so much a new house or a new boyfriend or a girlfriend or a new job. I mean, those things are all good and they come, but what behind those things is your good? Is your good joy? Is it love? Is it a greater experience of sufficiency or prosperity? Is it a sense of health and well-being? Because if that becomes our attention, then something happens in us that begins to organize ourselves towards that thing. Now, this Palestinian that I follow also had another parable, and it's called The Sower of the Seeds. It's one of my favorite parables. And the story is this. He says that once a sower goes out and sows seeds. And he says that some of those seeds fell on the road and they were trampled underfoot and never took root. Some of those seeds went into rocky soil. And even though they grew a little, they withered for lack of moisture. Some of those seeds went into the weeds, and they grew, but they were choked, and they never followed through. And some of those seeds went into good soil and produced 10, 20, 6 times the amount of fruit. So I think that this is a very interesting way of seeking our good. Because what those seeds are our thoughts. And what I would offer is, where do we plant our thoughts? Because, Jesus coming from the first century, the agrarian model, people would understand gardening. In fact, one of the things that I was telling somebody this last night, if you want to advance on the spiritual path, plant a garden. In fact, plant some food that you can eat, because that will take you far. But let's look at this. So if some of these seeds go on the road, they're trampled by the same old things that always trample things, that nothing gets a root. Because if you take a thought, but your consciousness is filled with shame, blame, regret, it doesn't have a chance. Shame is that sense that says, there's something wrong with me. Blame is that sense that says there's something wrong with you. Regret is the sense that says it's too late. So if that's your modality of thinking, if that is the road that you are traveling, plant a seed on that and it will go nowhere. Or plant a seed in rocky soil. And rocky soil is that, I think in many ways, is that place where we are seeking the approval of others, where we are giving away the authorship, the authority of our life to someone else, that we don't want to take action unless we feel that it's okay, And as a result of that, we may have an idea, but if we're often referencing that idea back to somebody else, if this thought is trying to take root, but we're trying to see how other people think about that thought and where it's going, it's going to choke. Or perhaps our sense is so cluttered with weeds, weeds that are afraid of humiliation, afraid of taking a risk, afraid of doing something. They get choked. But that soil that has been prepared, that we have done the inner work, a place where in our consciousness, in our thoughts, in our heart primarily, we are open and receptive. We allow a new experience, a new thought to come in to expand us, and there's nothing that can stop us. So as we're discerning our good, I often feel that one way that we can discern this is something that the Stoics teach, which is this. If we look at the obstacles to our good, they will often point the way to our good. If we are seeking a sense of joy, and yet we are holding a concept that we're not deserving of it, we can kind of look and see where that trajectory is. So we look at our good. And what Emma says is the first thing that we do is we name our good. And then we begin to dismantle the stories around why that good can't come to us. So I'm as Reverend Michael says, I'm sort of a perennial student, and I've lately been studying the work of a man by the name of Peter Abelard. And Peter Abelard lived about 1,000 years ago. He was a philosopher, he was a mystic, he was a great teacher. He has an interesting, sordid history that I won't get into this morning. But one of the things that he talked about was the concept of suffering. Now, we don't talk about much in New Thought about suffering, but I'm going to kind of offer what it is and actually how we can use it. Because according to Abelard, suffering is the struggle of the will to the way things are. It's kind of like what Freud says, right? Freud says, our perennial struggle is what? Who we are and who we want to be. What I have and what I want. What's in my life and what I'd rather my life would be. So it's this kind of struggle. And Abelard says it shows up in kind of two ways, active and passive in our life. The struggle in us. And let me give you a couple examples. So when he talks about passive suffering, he's talking about how things are and how we want them to be. And let me give you an example of that. So I used to have this great yellow lab named Baloo. I loved this dog. He was the kind of character dog that was on his own program. I would get calls from my neighbors saying, hey, if you're looking for Baloo, he's in our pool. Or he would be, he'd be coming in from the avocado groves, and apparently he had the lunch of one of the workers. I mean, he was just a character. And I loved this guy. And at 14 years old, as all good labs do, he went on to Jesus. And I loved him. And I would love to have him in my life today. But I can't. I can't. And so there's a suffering there of something that I want that cannot be. Do you understand what that means? And I think all of us have those sorts of things, right? We want something, we love somebody, but there's a loss in our life. And yet we have to reconcile that. And then he says there's this sense of active suffering. And let me give you kind of an example, and I'll be a little bit personal on active suffering, which is this. I could lose a few pounds. And one way that I could lose a few pounds is probably not to eat so many pastries. So giving up pastries, I love pastries. There is nothing like a tarte tatin to make my heart twitter. And the reality is, if I want something like, a different pant size or a different shirt size, if I want that, then it means that I am suffering because I cannot have something so that I can go for something else. Does this make sense to you guys? So we have this sense of who we are and what we want. And sometimes that creates a frustration with us. But what Abelard says is that leads us to virtue, a state of being. And the virtue that he offers, that it offers us, is the virtue of courage. And courage is a wonderful word because it means through the heart. So there was a public theologian back in the 50s by the name of Paul Tillich. And Paul Tillich was this amazing theologian. And he said something like this. He says, the courage to be, or rather a way of saying this, that sense of living full, that sense of full aliveness, the courage to fully live our life is rooted in the God who appears when God disappears in the anxiety of doubt. Let me say that again because it's a mouthful. The courage to be is rooted in the God who appears when God disappears in the anxiety of doubt. What Dr. Holmes says is our perception of God predicates our experience of God. If we are experiencing a sense of limitation in our life, maybe it's time for us to examine our idea of God. So there was a 12th century mystic by the name of Meister Eckhart who said it this way. He said, in time, our greatest obstacle to God is our belief in God. That sometimes, as Raymond Charles Barker says, our God is too small for the good that we are seeking. And the willingness to experience a greater sense of self is to allow ourselves to experience a greater sense of God. So I'm going to tell you guys something. I don't believe in God. Because Thinking, believing is an activity of mind. I experience God. I know God. I have this deep relationship with a living presence. It's not based on a belief. It's grounded in an experience of a living presence who appears when an old idea and an old belief gives way. And what Tillich says is how we begin to experience this new God is through grace. And he defines grace as this: to accept that you are accepted. To accept that you are accepted. There's nothing that you have to do. There's nothing that you have to earn. To accept that you are loved by a living presence that desires your good. To accept that you are enough. To accept that there is enough. To accept that in God there is no time. To accept in God all things are made new. To accept that you are accepted is the grace that allows us to embrace this new concept of divinity that strengthens our heart to be in full livingness, which is joy, which was defined as the mystics as the kingdom of heaven. And so I offer you this thought, that if you accept it and allow your mind to be expanded, there's no going back. Thank you for your kind attention.